So we were saying yesterday that Rabbi Eliezer has he has a laid back, or he has an interesting view on muktzah, in the sense that he will, take some wood and he'll turn it into a toothpick. He'll collect wood to burn from the whole courtyard. He'll make a fire. And the sages are a little bit more restrained. They will only take wood from basically from the house, or from right in front of the house, and they will only use wood to make a fire. Now, we're going to carry on with Rabbi Eliezer's unique approach to muktzah, but we're going to also continue with the question of fire. And we've said before that the Mishnah seems to associate an idea at the end of one Mishnah with the same idea at the beginning of the next one. It's as if it goes in a chain from idea to idea. And so we closed the sixth Mishnah with the question of making fire. And now we're going to open the seventh Mishnah with the same issue, making fire. And by the way, we're returning to our pattern of Mishnayot that begin Ein. Remember that the fourth chapter, before we got on to Rabbi Eliezer, the fourth chapter was just a string of things you don't do on Yom Tov. Ein, ein, ein. And we're going to close the fourth chapter returning to this pattern. Ein motzin et ha'ur lo limina. We don't produce fire. Ein motzin et ha'ur. We're not going to make a new fire on Yom Tov. Lo mina eitzim, not from sticks. I guess we're rubbing sticks together to make fire. Velo mina avanim, these must be things like flints, so we're clicking them together to make fire. Velo min afar. Now, the commentators say that they had certain kinds of very sort of hard dirt or clay or earth. Afar is earth. They had some kind of earth. Maybe this was, I don't know, magic earth that you could make fire out of. We don't really know what this is now. But anyway, the Mishnah says you can't make fire out of earth. Velo min hamayim, you don't make it out of water. Now, the Gemara explains here that they are using the water actually as a tool to refract light. So they'd put water in a glass vessel, and then they would use that glass vessel to focus the rays of light of the sun. And then that would heat up some tinder and that would make light. And we've seen, actually, we saw in the Mishnah of Shabbat that the rabbis know about using the sun to warm things up on Shabbat. But we're not going to make fire with the sun on Shabbat, even with water. Ve'ein melabnin es harafim litzlot b'hem. And we're not going to make tiles. We're not going to basically roast tiles. We're not going to put tiles in a kiln to make them hot to roast on. And this seems to be something about actually finishing off the tile. If it's a new tile, and I guess they did not have kilns in those days, which are as hot as the kilns that we had now. If you had a new tile, then its nature would change. Maybe it becomes more water resistant if you heat it up to a high temperature. First time you heat it up. And it seems, at least from the commentators, as though this idea of heating up the tiles to roast something on them is to do with finishing off the tile. And actually, the Rambam says specifically this only applies to new tiles. So old tiles are fine. You can heat them up and then put food on them. So we have segued, we've drifted actually from fire in order to heat things up. And of course, there's an important principle that although on Yom Tov, we are going to use fire to cook with, we're not going to make new fire. We're going to use an existing fire to cook with. And the Bartanura makes a comment, which I can't resist bringing, actually. Ein motzin or we don't make new fire. Mishum de molid, because it's like giving birth. Creation of a new fire is creation of a new thing. Mishum de molid dami lemalacha, because giving birth to something is like creative action. It's like the creation of, melacha is the word that God used to describe God's actions when he created the world. Because you'd create this new fire on Yom Tov. We don't create new things on Yom Tov, and that includes creating fire, even though we can create food. So now let's go back to Rabbi Eliezer. And it's very interesting that he's going to use the word, Rabbi Eliezer is talking about the concept of muktzah, something which is muktzah, something which is set aside or not set aside. If it's not set aside, we can't use it on Yom Tov. But the word muktzah itself applies to some kind of storeroom where you would set things aside. And there seems to be a play on words here, because we're going to talk about Rabbi Eliezer's attitude to muktzah, but we're going to use the word muktzah. The Olamar Rabbi Eliezer said one more thing, in addition to what he said about making wood and turning it into a toothpick. Omer adam ala muktzeh. Erev Shabbat Bashva'it. A man can stand at his muktzeh. And here we're referring to some kind of storeroom, some kind of store place for fruit, where you lay your fruit out to dry. So you've got your fruit laid out to dry up there, or maybe your vegetables as well. It's not designated for eating on Yom Tov, but we want to designate it for eating on Yom Tov. So just like we're going to go to the dove cut and say, oh yeah, I'm going to designate these 3 doves to slaughter on Yom Tov, we're going to designate for Shabbat by going up to the muktzah. And we're going to say, Omer adam ala muktzah erev Shabbat bashva'it ve'omer. A person stands at his fruit store on the eve of Shabbat in the sabbatical year, and he says, Mikan ani ochel lemachar. From here, I will eat tomorrow. In other words, he designates the food in his store for eating tomorrow. Why is it important that he does this on the sabbatical year? Because on the sabbatical year, Bashva'it, there's no problem about ma'aser. Generally, he'd have to take ma'aser in order to eat from this food. And we assume that if the food is still drying in the fruit store, it's not finished. So maaser hasn't been taken. But we know in the 7th year, no maaser is necessary because we don't own the produce. So at least in the 7th year, he can make this general designation. He can eat on Shabbat, and he doesn't have to worry about taking maaser on Shabbat, which he can't do. And the sages will not agree with him. The sages generally do not agree with Rabbi Eliezer. V'chachamim omrim ad sheyirshom ve'yomar mikan ve'ad kan. The sages say this doesn't work, guys, until he actually yirshom, until he writes it down or marks it, till he marks it out and says, from here to here, I'm going to eat. And in other words, we can't be general when we designate food for Shabbat. We have to be specific. And that is the close of the 4th chapter. Let's just start the 5th chapter today. We're going to finish the 5th chapter on Friday, but let's just make a start on the 5th chapter today. And we're breaking the pattern of Ain. Right through the 4th chapter, there's, we don't do this, we don't do that, we don't do the other. These Mishnayot start Ain, 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 Ain. Now we're through the 5th chapter, we're going to run through a set of things that we do. And we're going to begin actually with the dried fruit. So again, the Mishnayot are operating like a chain from idea to idea. So we were in Rabbi Eliezer's fruit store. It was probably on the roof of his house, actually, because the fruit are drying. They're set out to dry on the roof of his house. And suddenly it starts to rain. Now, we haven't designated this food for eating. We're not planning to eat it. So we can't move it on Yom Tov. But hang on, it's set out to dry, and it started to rain, and there's a financial loss here. And if we're in a agrarian society where maybe that's our harvest of fruit for the year, it's a significant financial loss. And even though it's Yom Tov, we can't just let that fruit get damp on the roof. Or at least that's what the rabbis are going to tell us. And in general, of course, the rabbis want to make it easy for us to observe Yom Tov, because they know that the Jewish people, well, that's their derech. They want the Jewish people to keep mitzvot. I mean, I wish all rabbis were like this today. So they want the Jewish people to keep mitzvot, and they say, Mashilin perot derech aruba b'yom tov. We can throw the fruit down. We can throw the fruit down through a trap door on Yom Tov. Aval lo b'Shabbat, not on Shabbat. So we're not going to do this on Shabbat. We are on Yom Tov. We can move the food around on Yom Tov. M'chasim perot b'kelim mipnei adelef, and we can cover up fruit with vessels, with cooking vessels, for example, with whatever we have, on account of drips. So the delef, the word delef here in Hebrew means something dripping in. So it feels as if maybe there's a leak in the roof, or maybe they're open to the sky and rain has begun to pitter-patter, pitter-patter. Anyway, there's water dripping down on the fruit. So we're going to cover them up with kelim, with vessels of different kinds. And similarly, jars of wine and jars of oil, which are valuable, which are very valuable. And they're going to be spoiled if we let water drip into them on Yom Tov. And if we've got these drips dripping into our space, where we can put a vessel to catch the drips even on Shabbat.